This is the story of the Twits, Part 2. If you remember, it's written by Roald Dahl and the illustrations are by Quentin Blake. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick down to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't even notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly that you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same thing with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong. I couldn't for the life of me think what it was."
"There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself.
"What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer."
"Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow."
"Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit.
"It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now."
"That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit.
"You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit.
"It's not possible."
"Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days."
"Never," she cried.
"Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are. You're sitting on your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs, he'd stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, and he'd done the same to the four legs on Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried. "And you've shrunk so much, your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for
her at all.
I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks, he said.
What? Gasped Mrs. Twit. What happens?
Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes.
I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit.
It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world.
How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face.
Oh, at the rate you're going,
he said, shaking his head sadly,
I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days.
But isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit.
Oh, there's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit.
Tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly.
We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit.
I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit.
You won't last long if you don't,
said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks.
You've got to be stretched.
Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the giant stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground.
Stand there,
he said, pointing to the iron ring. Then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled up on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and even some to her hair. Soon, there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head.
Can you feel them stretching you?
Asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. They're stretching me like mad. He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upward by the balloon, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? She gasped. If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me. And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon, Mrs. Twit cried out.
Take you to the moon? Exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no.
We most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe.
Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit.
And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed. Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was up high in the sky and climbing fast.
Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old hag is lost and gone forever." Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "it will stop going up and start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all. And because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up, and so now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoats billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and 1,000 birds came flying in from miles around just to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit, who thought he'd seen the last of his ugly wife for a long time, was sitting in the garden, celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up at her, he gaped, he gasped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, "Ah! Ow! I'll get you for this!" shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating right down on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll nash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get on with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. Looks like a prison. Not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what they're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows are meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky things and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out nasty, nosy little children." If you went near the house, you could see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side, there is the big dead tree. It never had any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, and you'll hear about them later. That's the end of part
2.